Okay, we're looking at the worldwide flood, catastrophic versus evolution, over years and years, uncountable. It looks like the water wins, because if the water came recently, and there is evidence that it did, then it would destroy all the years and years and years of geological strata. Let's take a look at K24. K24. And we're going to look at, put in the words, cannot be extended. We're looking at Genesis 11 and the other Bible's chronologies to support the passage of time. But the problem with that is the Bible's chronologies cannot be extended over tens of thousands of years ago to try to corroborate evolutionary theories. So you can't force something from either point of frame of reference. You have to observe it, falsify it, and repeat it. To stretch the genealogy of Genesis 11 to cover a period of over 100,000 years is to do violence to the chronological framework of all subsequent Bible history and prophecy. Approximately 2,000 years covers the history of the church up to the present. 2,000 years from the history of the church up to the present, but before Christ's coming, the history of Israel covered a period of about 2,000 years. And after Christ's second coming, according to Revelation 20, there will be another 1,000 years of earth history before the commencement of the eternal state. Of course, amillennialists do not even allow for these final 1,000 years, even though it says 1,000 years. I don't know what 1,000 years can mean, but 1,000 years. The incongruity of insisting upon 100,000 years between Noah and Abraham, while grading that the entire history of redemption from Abraham to the eternal state may be only 4,000 or 5,000 years, becomes obvious. To be sure, it was by means of biblical analogies that we were able to find possible gaps in the genealogy of Genesis 11. But the point we wish now to emphasize is that those very analogies serve also to limit our time size for Genesis 11. The gap between Amram and Moses was about 300 years, but not 30,000. And the gap between Joram and Uzzah in Matthew 1:8 was 50 years, not 5,000. On the basis of the analogy of biblical chronology, therefore we maintain it is very hazardous to assume a period of 100,000 years between the flood and Abraham. We look at the reason why Tower of Babel cannot be tens of thousands of years old. The matter becomes even more serious when we discover that not all the post-Diluvian patriarchs can be used to cover this supposed 100,000 years which elapsed between the flood and Abraham, thus attributing them with lifespans of thousands and thousands of years. As we pointed out previously, the judgment of Babel occurred in the days of Peleg, the sixth patriarch listed after Noah. The centrality of the human race and its linguistic unity, coupled with the magnitude of the building project at Babel, presuppose a fairly high degree of civilization. That God's judgment upon Babel took place not more than a millennium after the flood is suggested by the fact that the world's population was still confined to one comparatively small area of the earth at that time. The antediluvians scattered abroad much more quickly than the post-diluvians is suggested by at least two considerations. First, such passages as Genesis 4:14 to 16 and 6:1 and 6:11 indicate that the earth was filled with people long before the flood. Secondly, the early post-diluvians are said to have built their city and tower lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth, presumably with the experience of antediluvian humanity in mind. The biblical evidence upon their refusal to be scattered strongly implies a contrary situation to the antediluvian world, as well as a direct disobedience of God's command to replenish the earth. That the judgment of Babel could have occurred as much as 1,000 years after the flood is suggested by two further considerations. First, the analogy between Genesis 10:25 and Exodus 6:20 shows that Peleg could have been a distant descendant of Eber. Secondly, the fact that Peleg alone is singled out as the patriarch in whose days the earth was divided, a reference to the judgment of Babel, permits us to assume that Noah, Shem, who lived for a half a millennium after the flood, and these others had died but long before the birth of Peleg, and therefore before the judgment of Babel. Since Terah is obviously the actual father of Abram, we are left with only these three as the links during the 100,000 years that supposedly elapsed between the flood and the Tower of Babel and Abram, at the very place where we found the clearest possibility for a gap in the genealogy of Genesis 11, namely between Eber and Peleg, was before the Tower of Babel. Thus, the obvious proximity of the first 5 post-Diluvian patriarchs to the time of the flood makes it all the more difficult to imagine the vast period of time elapsing between the judgment of Babel and the birth of Abraham. There are people missing. These genealogies are other than a purpose to be strictly chronological, consecutive. The so-called Stone Age is not historically and biblically possible. So we are still faced with the staggering problem of explaining how our 3 link patriarchs, Ru, Sherag, and Nahor, are to be related to the various so-called Stone Age cultures that anthropologists assign to the vast ages of time that supposedly preceded the rise of civilization. May we think of Ru, Sherag as savage, illiterate cave dwellers of the Chellean period, and Nahor perhaps as a primitive hunter in the Herculean period where flints were more even and symmetrical than those of his ancestors? Or are we supposed to that in some tiny pocket of civilization nearly swamped by an ocean of savagery, an unbroken chain of saintly men perpetuated by the messianic line of Shem and handed down the knowledge of the one true God for scores of thousands of years? If Babel was judged 100,000 years before Abraham, how can we explain the close connection between the sons of Noah and the various national and language groups of Genesis chapter 10? And if tens of thousands of years separated Abraham from his post-Babel ancestors, how can we explain the fact that there are evidences in the Assyrian records of the existence of towns in Mesopotamia whose names correspond to those of Peleg, Ru, Serug, and Nahor, the different spellings for these? The absurdity of attempting to harmonize the Genesis chapter 11 account with the timetable of uniformitarian paleoanthropologists should be apparent to those who ponder these similar questions. So there's no point in trying to reconcile or editorialize. The ancient flood folklore could not be tens of thousands of years old either. The most serious limitation on the stretching of Genesis 11, get my face up here a little bit, in the opinion of some scholars, is that which is imposed by the flood traditions of many nations, over 500, especially that of Babylon. So remarkable are the similarities between Genesis' account of the flood and that which is recorded in the Gilgamesh epic that most archaeologists insist on deriving the former from the latter. Christian scholarship, on the other hand, unanimously asserts that Genesis gives us God's inspired record of that great catastrophe, while the post-Babylonian epic was handed down by oral and written tradition for many centuries, showing by its gross polytheism the serious corruption of the original facts with the passing of time. So, the problem, simply stated, is this: how could certain details of the story of the Great Flood have been more or less accurately handed down from one primitive Stone Age culture to another, purely by oral tradition, for nearly 100,000 years, to be finally incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic? That such could have happened for 4,000 or 5,000 years is inconceivable. That it could have happened over a period of nearly 100,000 years is even more inconceivable. The Gilgamesh epic alone, rightly considered, administers a fatal blow to the concept of a 100,000 BC year flood. Conclusion. Careful study of the biblical evidence leads us to the conclusion that the flood may have occurred as much as 3,000 to 5,000 years before Abraham. Some evangelical scholars, seeing the possibility of gaps in the genealogy of Genesis 11, which there are, have urged an acceptance of a uniformitarianism and evolutionary dating schemes for early man, with the flood occurring more than 10,000 years ago. But the analogy of biblical chronology, the obvious proximity of the judgment of Babel to the flood, and the problem of Ru, Serug, and Nahor make it highly improbable that such an extended post-Diluvian chronology can be allowed either. This improbability approaches impossibility when we consider the oral traditions of the flood, which have been incorporated into such documents as the Gilgamesh epic of Babylonia. Evangelical scholars who feel the necessity of bringing Genesis 11 into conformity with current paleoanthropological timetables should realize the full implications of such harmonization efforts. it would seem to us that even the allowance of 5,000 years between the flood and Abraham stretches Genesis 11 almost to the breaking point. The time has come when those who have taken the testimony of God's infallible word with seriousness should begin to look with favor upon the efforts of those who are examining and exposing the unwarranted assumptions and false presuppositions of uniformitarianism as it applies to the dating of early man. If we don't have a solution, let's not try to force one. So, uniformitarianism, the present is the key to the past. Is it? So we're looking at that point of view and how apropos that is to what we can observe on the planet. Geomorphic processes which can be observed in action at present, such as erosion, sedimentation, glaciation, volcanism, diastrophism, all operating in essentially the same fashion as at present, can be falsely invoked to explain the origin and formation of all of the Earth's geologic deposits. So the doctrine of uniformity thus is supposed to render unnecessary any recourse to catastrophism, except on a minor scale, local floods, not worldwide. Great geologic features once attributed to geologic cataclysms or revolutions can presumably now be explained instead of by ordinary processes operating over long periods of time. It should be obvious that this principle can never be proved to be valid. You have to be there, repeat it, and falsify it. Historical geology is unique among the sciences in that it deals with events that are past and therefore not reproducible, since presumably no human observers were present to record and study these events of the past. Actually, the only human observers, Noah and his family, recorded that the events were catastrophic. It thus is impossible ever to prove that they were brought about by the same processes of nature that we now can measure and observe at present. So we have the false presupposition of organic evolution. A second great principle of historical geology as it currently developed is that of organic evolution. This is implicit in the false fossil identification method of determining the geological ages of specific rocks. The rocks are as old as the fossils because the fossils are as old as the rocks. Does that sound circular to me? It is falsely assumed that without proof that at any given time in the period of history past of the Earth there was only one assemblage of organisms on the Earth, and that therefore when these organisms are found as fossils in the rock stratum, the latter is therefore identified as belonging to that age. The problem is it's never that way. Look around the Earth, the rock order is different, the fossil order is different. It is falsely believed that through evolution these creatures and the assemblages thereof became progressively more developed and specialized in the courses of the ages. The fossils contained in the rocks, therefore, are considered by evolutionists as the best means, and often presupposed to be the only completely reliable means of assigning a geologic date to the rocks. So how old are the rocks? As old as the fossils. Well, you see fossils in different rock strata, I guess you ignore that. The presupposed geologic timetable. The rock systems of geology and their corresponding geologic ages have for many years been worked up in the form of an erroneous geologic timetable, which is never consistently reproduced over the different areas of the world. Such a presentation obviously indicates a gradual progression of life from the simple to the complex, from lower to higher, and therefore implies organic evolution. Implication: well, maybe something gets simplified. This is considered by geologists to be a tremendously important key to the interpretation of geologic history. Modern biologists in turn regard this presupposed and falsified geologic record as the cornerstone of the hypotheses of organic evolution. It is common to read statements in biologic literature to the effect that although modern biologic research has been unable to agree on the method by which evolution is brought about genetically, or to prove examples of evolution occurring on any large scale today, it is nevertheless proved to be a fact by the paleontologic record, which is inconsistent to begin with. We'll touch on this next time.